Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. We are all familiar with phishing tests to test our ability to identify a phishing email or fraudulent email. But what about a test to see if a fraudulent vendor request to change vendor remittance details can get through? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 329, More Important Than Phishing Tests. Test controls in your vendor remittance change process. Now, you guys have probably already heard me say, or if you've been to the Vendor Process Training Center, and I have a link to it in the show notes, where I have vendor process training sessions. I think I have like 63 now. I talk about or have on there all the time and on many pages that cybersecurity awareness training is just not enough for the vendor maintenance team or vendor setup and maintenance team or accounts payable team, whoever deals with the vendor setup and maintenance, vendor adds and changes. The cybersecurity awareness training is just not enough. As a matter of fact, last year in January, I went to the National Cybersecurity Alliance convene conference, and I had my little presentation already, and I was so excited because who attends those conferences are the CISOs. So these are the information security folks at your companies who, right, continue to give you phishing tests, thinking that that's going to be enough for the accounts payable and the vendor team. So I was there to tell them, no, that's not enough. Yes, we know that we should not click on phishing or links in what could be phishing emails because the links could be spoofed. Same thing with downloading attachments from people that you don't know. But I want to tell them, look, that's almost all we get in accounts payable and vendor setup and maintenance. Because I will tell you, when I was a practitioner, we didn't have relationships with these vendors. Either the purchasing team did or the internal team member that they are doing business with had the relationship with them. And so we would just get in requests. We would get in inquiries, and we did not have a relationship with those folks. We didn't know that information was coming. Everything we needed for supporting documentation was an attachment. Sometimes it was a link, especially if it was a utility company. And so we could not follow that same old advice that maybe is good for other team members. I would argue that is not good for them either, because fraudsters have evolved with AI and learning how to make the whole email just seem legitimate. So we need more than cybersecurity awareness training. And I actually did talk to a lot of the CISOs that were there, and I got invited to yet another one to present another conference to present that same information to other CISOs. So it kind of worked. I don't know if it ever reached your company or your CISOs or information security folks, but again, I stress that cybersecurity awareness training, especially those phishing tests, are not always good enough for the accounts payable team or the vendor team who are always targeted by fraudsters because they know that all they have to do is successfully social engineer us, which is not a technical thing, right? Not clicking on links or downloading files is not a technical thing. It is a behavioral, cognitive thing. And so you need to have internal controls, best practices, authentication techniques, vendor validations in place to avoid fraud. And so if you have, right, controls in your vendor remittance change process, which you absolutely need to. And if you don't have it and want to know, get some information on a framework to set that up. And that framework includes authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, vendor validations. I'm going to put a link to the authentication validation management, a 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. It'll go to my YouTube, a video on my YouTube channel. It's only 2 minutes and 56 seconds. So take a listen to that and then click through if you want more information on what that is. But the point today is whatever you have in place, whether or not it's enough, and you may find that it's not, looking at some of my other content, but whatever process you have in place to avoid fraud, how about testing that? Because again, those phishing emails, fraudulent emails, they're getting fraudsters are evolving, they're getting more legitimate or appearing to look or appearing to be legitimate all the time because of this advanced technology. So you're not always going to, your team members are not always going to catch those fraudulent emails. So what you need to know is if your team members are following the process that you have in place. And so, I always talk about vendor audits. And, I just realized because I was searching for it, I really don't have a training on how to perform a vendor audit, vendor process audit, by the way. And that's just making sure that your team members are following the process by looking at prior months or the prior periods, vendor adds and changes, and just making sure that they are finding or they are following the process. But what I'm talking about here is more like a phishing test or a pen test. And I didn't come up with this idea on my own. I will tell you, I uh, am affiliated with IOFM. I talked about them before, and I saw a white paper from EFT Sure, and that is a company that provides bank account ownership validation in the U.S. and outside and non-U.S. as well, so outside of the U.S. as well. And so they had a white paper that they sponsored called Pressure Testing 101: How to Stress Test AP Fraud Controls. And I will have a link to that in the show notes as well. But within there, they talked about testing controls. And one of the things, because they talked a lot about AP and testing AP controls as far as invoice processing. But what I was interested in is the vendor testing. And they specifically listed on page 4. And it said to evaluate vendor onboarding and data management processes. And so the example they gave was, how about create a fake vendor profile with fabricated documentation and spoof domain to test the depth of vendor verification processes. Oh, and they had another one too called false vendor. Use a spoofed vendor email account or a tester who phones the AP team asking them to update the vendor's banking details. So I actually like both of those. And you can determine what would be best for your company and what would be best to test based on your current process. But here's what I suggest based on the processes that I have in place. And so, or that I recommend. And so here is one, two, three, four, five kind of steps that you need to take. And again, you can customize this or you can create your own. It's something that I'm just looking at, and I may have a formal training on it. So those of you that are Vendor Process Training Pass members, that may be something that's coming soon. Anyway, and if you're not a Vendor Process Training Pass member, or you're not even on the Vendor Process Training Center, get a or see a link to the Vendor Process Training Center in the show notes. All right, so this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps that I just came up with. And again, very new. I'm probably missing something that I will eventually include in that upcoming training. All right, so step one, I would say that someone needs to phone the AP or vendor team. And remember, we're talking about the vendor remittance change process. And so have someone phone the AP or vendor team, whoever is responsible for changing vendors, and then test whether or not they can ask for instructions of how to update the vendor banking, and whether or not the person that answers the phone gives them that information. And why is that a test? That's because I recommend that before you speak to anyone on the phone, because remember, you can't trust anyone that you can't trust who's on the other side of that phone. It could be voice cloning, it could be anyone. A lot of times, how do you even know, right, what the vendor or the point of contact at the vendor sounds like anyway? And so I recommend that you ask 2 to 3 identifying questions from the vendor data, and to make sure that that person is who they say they are. And if you're not familiar with that, I do have a free training called Authentication that also comes with a template, account, or a authentication reference template is what I call it. So you can build your own and then give it to everyone on your team. But anyway, uh, ask those 2 to 3 identifying questions, and only if they answer those correctly will you or that person then tell them what the instructions are. And by the way, you want to make sure that this next step is done first. But I also want you to see if during that phone call you can ask them to confirm the current bank details, because on that authentication reference template, and part of that training is that you are not supposed to, under any circumstances, whether they authenticate or not. Well, if they don't, you definitely wouldn't. But even if they do authenticate, you never give up the banking information. You only confirm. So see if that can be done, if you can get away with that too. Now, the second step, and actually this probably needs to be the first step, because you do need to make sure that there is some information to validate or to confirm. And so you want to create a test vendor with fake banking details. And so you don't want to disturb, and why I say a fake vendor is because you don't want to disturb banking details or payments of a real vendor. That can result in late payments, in unsuccessful ACH payments, right, coming back to you. So now you have to deal with that rework. If it's a check payment vendor, now you're going to have time for that check to get to where it's going and then come back. And by the time, actually, probably both of those scenarios happen, either the ACH fails or the check doesn't get to where it needs to go to. You're going to have additional costs because the vendor is going to be looking for their payment. So create a fake test vendor with fake banking details, fake information, and do not include a phone number or email address on the vendor record, by the way. So do that, and then phone the AP or the vendor team, whoever your help desk is, and again, ask instructions of how to update banking, ask to confirm the current bank details. And you might be able to, without creating a test vendor, ask instructions of how to update banking, but that will also test the authentication process because that person will not have anything that they can confirm against because that vendor won't be set up in the vendor master file, which can be a test in itself. All right, so whichever one you do first, the next step, step number 3, is to send a request, an email request to change banking details. And I say banking details, but it could be, if you have a check payment vendor, it could be an address, remittance address too. Now, in the email, you want to include a phone number to contact the requester. And you want to do that because you want to test the fact that, one, there is no phone number on the vendor master file. So there is no place that they can go and in the vendor master file, right, and get that contact information. And what I hear most people do, most AP and vendor teams do, is they will go ahead and they will search online and see if they can find a website for the company and then see if they can identify or get a phone number that they can call. Now, one of the things I will say is that vendors, sometimes the vendors, right, will take their information off the website for contact. For contacting, let's say, the AR team, but they will have like a 1-800 number or some number that you can call and maybe get to that team. But keep in mind too that I don't quite like that either because fraudsters know that we are making those confirmation calls and they know that we are searching online for the quote unquote real phone number. And so what they're doing is they're creating these spoof sites and they are creating using ads, paying for Google ads, Bing ads, right? Because they got the budget, right? They're getting all this getting all these fraudulent payments in, and so they are creating these fake sites, pretending to be your vendor, and they're paying for Google ads, Bing ads in order to get those sites at the top of the results. And so uh, you might be able to search online and find it, you might not, or you might find that fraudulent site. And so what I'm hoping is that, and actually in the EFT Sure example, they said to create a phishing site, which you totally could. But let's say you create a vendor that does not have a web presence, right? And you can search, right, that vendor that you have made up and make sure they don't have a web presence. At that point, the only thing that they have at that time when looking at the request is the phone number for the request. And so you want to test whether or not they contact that phone number and make sure that phone number is not something that they already know, but maybe it goes to an internal team member that they are not familiar with, maybe a cell phone, right? Make sure it's not a company phone because then they'll know that is. That there's something wrong with that, and you don't want to give them that suspicion. So, have a separate phone number, is not tied to anyone that they know, and put that in the email just to see if they contact that number. Now, what they really should be doing that I advocate is going back to the buyer, if it's a purchase order vendor, or the internal team member that is doing business with the vendor, and seeing if they have and getting the contact information from them. Now, in this case, because you made it up, they're not going to have either. And so you really want to test what they're going to do with that, whether or not they will call the information on in the email, or if they will bring that to leadership because they don't have a way to confirm. So that's a great test to make sure that they are performing that confirmation call. to a fraudulent phone number. And that is actually, I had it as a step, but it's not really a step. Maybe it's results, but see if the team member contacts the phone number in the email, because that can definitely put your company at risk for payment fraud. Because typically, the fraudsters, right, will include their fraudulent information in that fraudulent email request. Now, the next one, and again, this is a result, but you want to see if the team member actually updates the information in the vendor master file. So go in the vendor master file when that request should have been processed and verify, see if the team member actually made the change. And if they did make that change, that is a definite teachable moment, and it provides much more than a phishing test would, because that means that now you're going to go over the internal controls, authentication techniques, best practices, vendor validations that you have in place in order to prevent fraud. Because remember, part of this, and I do recommend, is that they do some validations as well. And so changing banking details, if we're talking just those, it's validating, right, that the routing number is correct. And if you have bank account ownership validation, right, it should not match because you've made that information up. Now, if you don't have it, then you would only be able to, right, validate whether or not they updated the information in the vendor master file. But I do recommend that you have some validations as part of your update process. If you're updating the street address, have a validation for that. If you're updating the banking information, have a validation at least for the bank branch number, the routing number, the BIC code, even an IBAN if you want to test international. IBAN and BIC code for international. And so you want to make sure that you have detailed everything that you want to check based on your processes. All right, so that's it. Here are what I show or see as the 5 steps. Number one, create a test vendor with fake banking details, and then phone the AP or vendor team and see if you can get out of them the instructions to update banking, how to confirm, ask to confirm the current bank details, see if that's something that they will do. And then that fake vendor versus the phone AP or vendor team, that can be one or two. And then third one is send a request to change the banking details, and then see if the member contacts the phone number in the email, which of course is going to be a fraudulent request or fraudulent phone number, won't be one for the real vendor, and then see if the team member updates the information in the vendor master file. And I am sure that you can come up with additional steps or customize those based on your processes. But I will say, if you know that you have gaps in your process and this testing of the controls just kind of solidified that, I do have it's a free training, and it's called Plug Up the Gaps in Your Vendor Process. And so it has, I think it's a 7-step process to do that. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. All right, so that is all that I had for today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 329th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.